My name is Sienna, and 3 years after a brutal divorce, my ex-husband invited me to his lavish wedding for one reason: to humiliate me. He wanted to parade his new life, his new bride, and his newly minted executive title in front of the woman he once discarded in the rain. I showed up looking flawless, holding the hand of our 3-year-old daughter, the child he swore I was too broken to ever conceive. But the real shock was not the little girl standing beside me with his family's signature hazel green eyes. The real shock came when he tried to have me thrown out of the ultra-exclusive Atlanta estate he had rented for the night, only to find out that I actually owned the ground he was standing on. The dream wedding they had been waiting for turned into a public humiliation before everyone they wanted to impress. If you have ever had to stand completely still while your enemies dug their own graves, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to join a community of women who know that our silence is never weakness. It is simply the sound of us loading our weapons. Your worth is never defined by those who abandoned you. It is defined by what you build after they leave. The heavy thud of a velvet box hitting my penthouse marble island broke the quiet morning silence. A courier had just delivered it, requiring my personal signature. I opened the gold clasp with steady fingers. Inside rested a thick gold-plated wedding invitation. DeAndre and Valerie were formally requesting my presence to witness their grand union. Tucked beneath the heavy cardstock was a handwritten note on blush-pink stationery. The looping, arrogant handwriting belonged unmistakably to Valerie. It read, "VIP, seats are at the very back of the room. Come see what a real woman who actually makes him happy looks like." I stared at the note. I did not cry. I did not throw the box across the kitchen. The woman who would have wept over DeAndre died a very long time ago. Instead, I carefully folded the note and placed it in my evening clutch. It was the perfect accessory for tonight. I looked around my luxurious penthouse, a stark contrast to the cramped townhouse I once shared with my ex-husband. I had spent the last 3 years turning my pain into an empire, and tonight was the culmination of my silent labor. I walked into the nursery where my daughter Naomi was quietly playing with her wooden blocks. I knelt beside her gently, buttoning her designer wool coat. She looked up at me with those striking hazel green eyes. They were a rare genetic trait, an exact mirror of DeAndre's late grandfather. It was the kind of undeniable biological signature that no lie could ever erase. Seeing those eyes brought a sudden vivid rush of the night my old life ended. The memory was sharp, cold, and absolutely unforgiving. 3 years ago, the rain was pouring down in heavy sheets outside our modest townhouse. DeAndre had just thrown my suitcases onto the wet pavement. I was shivering, begging him to listen, begging him to look at the small plastic stick clutched in my trembling hand. A positive pregnancy test. We had tried for years. I had endured endless medical appointments, whispered pity from his mother Corinne, and his growing cold resentment. But that night DeAndre did not want to look at the test. He looked at me with absolute disgust. He told me I was a useless, barren woman who was holding back his potential. He said he needed a vibrant, successful partner, someone like Valerie who was young and full of life, not a depressed wife who could not even give him an heir. I remember looking past his shoulder and seeing his mother Corinne standing in the hallway. She did not intervene. She simply smirked, sipping her tea as her son discarded me like trash. DeAndre locked the door, leaving me in the freezing rain with nothing but the clothes on my back and a secret life growing inside me. I survived that night. I survived the brutal divorce proceedings that followed, where he fought to leave me with absolutely nothing, claiming I contributed zero value to his rising career as an investment director. He never knew about the child I carried. He never checked on me. He simply erased me from his narrative and paraded Valerie around Atlanta as his ultimate prize. He built a grand new life on the completely false narrative that I was a pathetic failure who could not keep a man, telling everyone who would listen that I was the sole reason for his unhappiness. But pain is a remarkable teacher. I took the small settlement I managed to fight for, combined it with a relentless drive forged in absolute heartbreak, and built Apex Holdings. I operated entirely in the shadows. To the public and to DeAndre, I was just a defeated ex-wife who had faded into obscurity. In reality, I was the founder of a venture capital firm that ruthlessly acquired companies across the East Coast. I smoothed Naomi's curls and kissed her forehead. Tonight, her father would finally meet her, and he would meet the woman he threw away. I walked over to my desk and picked up my phone. I dialed my corporate attorney, Desmond. He answered on the first ring. The tone of his voice was sharp and ready for instruction. Desmond is a brilliant legal mind, completely devoted to the incredible growth of Apex Holdings. Desmond, I said, keeping my voice entirely even. I need you to initiate the final phase for the Vanguard accounts. Freeze everything associated with the corporate acquisition at exactly 8 o'clock tonight. There was a brief pause on the line before Desmond replied with professional satisfaction. Are you sure you want to pull the trigger tonight, Sienna? It will cause a massive operational failure for their executive team right in the middle of the weekend. I smiled a cold, practiced smile. That is exactly the point, Desmond. DeAndre thinks he is celebrating his promotion to investment director at Vanguard Equity today. I want the accounts frozen right when he is giving his toast. Make sure he cannot access a single cent of company funds. Consider it done, Desmond said. I hung up the phone. DeAndre had spent the last 3 years building a fragile house of cards financed by deceit, corporate theft, and Valerie's insatiable greed for elite social standing. Tonight, I was going to pull out the bottom card and watch the entire structure collapse. I chose my outfit with absolute precision. A floor-length midnight black silk gown that draped flawlessly, exuding authority and quiet wealth. No flashy logos, no desperate cries for attention, just the undeniable aura of a woman who owned every room she walked into. I held Naomi's hand as we took the private elevator down to the garage. My chauffeur opened the door of the Maybach. We slid into the spacious leather seats, and the car glided smoothly out into the Atlanta evening. The venue DeAndre and Valerie had chosen was the prestigious Rosewood Estate, an ultra-exclusive property known for hosting billionaires and visiting dignitaries. Renting it required not just astronomical wealth but severe social connections. Valerie had undoubtedly bragged about securing it for months to her thousands of fake followers. As the Maybach turned onto the winding manicured driveway of the estate, I saw the glowing lights of the grand ballroom in the distance. Valet attendants in crisp uniforms were rushing to open doors for the city's elite. My driver pulled right up to the main VIP entrance, bypassing the regular guest drop-off line. The moment the car stopped, the heavy oak doors of the estate swung open. Renee DeAndre's younger sister marched out onto the stone steps. She was wearing an obnoxiously bright bridesmaid dress and held a clipboard. Renee had always been a bitter enabler, a loyal lapdog to whoever had the most money or influence. When she saw my driver step out, she immediately recognized him from my previous visits to the estate on business. But she clearly did not know who was sitting in the back seat. Renee marched right up to the tinted window, tapping her manicured nail against the glass. "Excuse me, you cannot park here. This is the VIP entrance for the bridal party and Vanguard executives only. Guest parking is around the back near the service gates. Move this car right now before I call security and have you towed." My driver did not even flinch. He simply walked around to my side and opened the door. I stepped out into the cool evening air, the black silk of my dress catching the ambient light. I reached back in and gently lifted Naomi out, setting her on her feet beside me. Renee took a physical step backward, her jaw dropping open. She stared at me, then down at Naomi, her eyes widening in absolute shock. "Sienna, what are you doing here? You actually showed up. And whose kid is that?" She let out a harsh, mocking laugh, quickly trying to regain her toxic confidence. "Valerie invited you as a joke. We did not think you would actually have the nerve to show your face in front of people who matter. Listen, you need to go around to the back. We are not letting you ruin my brother's perfect night with your depressing presence." I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply looked past her to the towering man in a dark suit hurrying down the estate steps. It was the head of security for the Rosewood property. He had a stern expression, clearly coming over to handle a disruption at the front door. Renee smirked, turning to the security chief. Finally, sir, can you please escort this woman and her child to the service entrance? Or better yet, just kick her off the property. She is harassing the bridal party and she does not belong here. The head of security stopped dead in his tracks. He did not look at Renee. He looked directly at my face. All the color drained from his cheeks. He quickly adjusted his earpiece, stepped past a confused Renee, and bowed a full 90 degrees. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke loud enough for the valet staff and arriving guests to hear. "Welcome to the estate, Madam Owner. Is everything to your satisfaction tonight?" Renee froze. Her smug smile vanished, replaced by an expression of complete and utter bewilderment. She looked from the bowing security chief to me, her mind entirely failing to process the words. "Madam Owner, what are you talking about? She works at a mid-level marketing firm. She is nobody." I looked at Renee, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "I bought the Rosewood estate 6 months ago, Renee. You are standing on my driveway, and if you speak to me or my daughter with that tone again, I will have security escort you out of your own brother's wedding." Renee's clipboard slipped from her fingers, clattering against the cobblestone. She stood paralyzed, her mouth opening and closing, without any sound coming out. I did not wait for her to recover. I took Naomi's small hand in mine, instructed the security chief to have my driver wait, and walked up the grand stone steps. The heavy oak doors loomed ahead. Inside, DeAndre and Valerie were playing the roles of the perfect wealthy couple, completely unaware that the woman they invited to humiliate was actually the architect of their impending destruction. The loud music echoed from the massive ballroom, and I pushed the doors open, ready to let the absolute and final reckoning begin. "Excuse me, everyone, but it seems we have a desperate wedding crasher." Valerie's voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom. The sharp sound cut through the elegant jazz music and instantly silenced the 300 guests in attendance. She stood in the center of the elevated stage, bathed in a bright spotlight. She was wearing a custom bridal gown that easily cost $50,000, a dress paid for with stolen funds. Her perfectly contoured face was twisted into a triumphant sneer as she pointed a manicured finger directly at the back of the room where I stood. Down on the polished marble floor, DeAndre was still completely paralyzed. His shattered champagne glass lay in sparkling pieces around his expensive leather shoes. The fine champagne soaked into the hem of his custom tuxedo trousers, but he did not notice. He could not tear his gaze away from my daughter Naomi. He was a man drowning in a sudden violent wave of realization. The hazel green eyes looking back at him were an exact replica of the patriarch who built his family original wealth. It was an unmistakable genetic marker. He knew in his bones that he was staring at his own flesh and blood. The crushing weight of his past actions slammed into his chest. He knew he had discarded a pregnant wife in the freezing rain 3 years ago. DeAndre's lungs heaved as he struggled to breathe. He reached a shaking hand toward Naomi, wanting to step forward, wanting to demand answers. But Valerie's voice boomed over the massive venue speakers again, completely shattering his fragile moment of revelation. "Yes, ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the back of the room. My husband, former wife Sienna, decided to grace us with her presence tonight. I suppose when you have absolutely nothing going on in your own life, you have to cling to the coattails of the man who finally left you behind." The entire ballroom turned in unison. Hundreds of the most influential figures in Atlanta, corporate and social scene, shifted their collective gaze toward the velvet ropes. I felt the heavy weight of their stares. The sudden hushed whispers rustled through the wealthy crowd like dry leaves in a storm. These were people who thrived on high society scandal. They expected to see a broken, weeping woman making an absolute fool of herself. They expected a spectacle of feminine desperation. DeAndre finally snapped out of his shock. He spun around, looking up at the grand stage in absolute horror. He realized instantly that Valerie was about to publicly humiliate the mother of the child he had just discovered. He scrambled toward the stage, his face pale with sudden frantic panic. "Valerie, stop right now!" DeAndre hissed loudly. He waved his hands frantically as he bounded up the carpeted stairs. "Turn the microphone off. Give it to me. Jesus. So. But Valerie was entirely drunk on the spotlight. She had craved this exact moment for 3 long years. She had built her entire fake lifestyle influencer persona around the narrative of being a wealthy heiress who rescued a brilliant corporate director from a miserable toxic marriage. She was not going to let him ruin her grand finale. She wanted her viral moment. As DeAndre reached for the microphone stand, Valerie sharply elbowed him in the chest. She pushed him away with surprising aggressive force. She covered the microphone with her hand for a split second and hissed at him to back off and let her handle the trash. Then she turned back to the elite crowd, her fake smile stretching even wider across her face. "Do not worry, darling," Valerie cooed into the microphone, feigning deep affection while her eyes locked onto me with pure, unfiltered malice. "I think it is actually quite sweet that she came tonight. We should be gracious hosts to the less fortunate. After all, I know how incredibly hard it has been for Sienna since the divorce. She has really struggled to move on from her past failures." Valerie gestured dramatically to the DJ booth situated on the carved wooden balcony above the stage. "In fact, I prepared a little something special tonight. I wanted to show everyone just how powerful true love can be. I wanted to show you exactly what my amazing husband was saved from." The massive digital screens flanking the stage suddenly flickered to life. The soft, ambient lighting of the ballroom dimmed, creating a cinematic atmosphere. I stood perfectly still, my posture flawless, as the screens displayed a giant presentation titled "The Before and After of DeAndre." The elite crowd let out a collective audible gasp. Valerie had actually prepared a slideshow to publicly assassinate my character. The first image flashed on the bright screen. It was a grainy paparazzi-style photograph of me taken just weeks after my brutal divorce. I was walking out of a discount grocery store in the pouring rain, looking exhausted, holding a single brown paper bag of groceries. "Look at this," Valerie narrated, her voice dripping with fake condescending sympathy. "This is what DeAndre had to come home to every single day. A woman who completely let herself go. A woman with no ambition, no drive, and absolutely no future. He was suffocating in a miserable, barren household while he was desperately trying to build his prestigious career at Vanguard Equity." Another photo clicked onto the screen. This one showed me sitting alone on a park bench, staring blankly ahead. Valerie had clearly hired a private investigator to follow me during my darkest days of early pregnancy and heartbreak. "I saved him from a life of utter mediocrity," Valerie proclaimed proudly, pressing her hand against her chest. "I brought light and joy back into his world. I gave him the elite corporate partnership he always deserved. We built this incredible life together because I actually know how to support a highly successful man." What the crowd did not know was the absolute irony of her arrogant words. Valerie had not built anything. 3 years ago, she had stolen my personal client list from my old marketing firm, using it to secure fake brand deals and launch her hollow influencer career. She had leeched off my hard work to buy her initial followers, pretending to be an oil heiress from Texas, when she was actually drowning in 6 figures of consumer debt. She was a master of illusion. I listened to her spin her pathetic web of lies without blinking. DeAndre was standing on the edge of the stage, covering his face with his trembling hands. He knew Valerie was going way too far. He could feel the dangerous shift in the atmosphere. The heavy silence from the Vanguard executives sitting in the front row was deafening. They were not amused by this trashy reality television display. They were deeply uncomfortable. Corporate leaders valued absolute discretion, and this public circus was professional suicide. Down on the marble floor, I felt a tiny warm hand tug at the black silk of my dress. I looked down. Naomi was staring up at the giant glowing screens, her rare hazel green eyes reflecting the bright, harsh lights. Her innocence was a stark contrast to the venomous display happening above us. I refused to let their toxicity touch her. She did not understand the cruelty of the words being spoken, but she sensed the heavy tension filling the room. I knelt down smoothly, ignoring the hundreds of judgmental eyes burning into my back. I adjusted the velvet bow in Naomi hair, my hands completely steady and sure. I ensured her coat was perfectly straight, smoothing the lapels with absolute maternal devotion. I offered my daughter a warm, reassuring smile. a smile that belonged only to her and contained none of the venom reserved for the people on that stage. "You are doing such a good job being quiet, my sweet girl," I whispered softly. "Mommy has to go to work for a few minutes. I need you to stay right here with Marcus and do not let go of his hand." I stood up and gestured to my towering lead bodyguard, who had silently stepped through the entrance behind me. Marcus moved forward immediately, his massive frame blocking the view of anyone trying to get too close to my daughter. He nodded respectfully, placing himself squarely between Naomi and the chaotic hostile ballroom. He was an impenetrable wall of security. I turned my attention back to the grand stage. Valerie was still talking, still projecting carefully selected images of my supposed misery. She was basking in the glow of her own perceived victory, completely blind to the executioner standing at the back of the room. She thought she had cornered a helpless victim. I did not run out in tears. I did not scream or throw a desperate tantrum. I did not give them the satisfaction of a broken, defeated woman. Instead, I began to walk. I stepped forward, my black silk gown gliding flawlessly over the polished marble floor. The sharp rhythmic click of my designer heels echoed loudly, cutting right through the sound of Valerie's amplified voice. The crowd of wealthy socialites, ruthless executives, and local politicians instinctively parted before me. The air in the room grew thick, heavy, with the undeniable scent of impending destruction. Women in diamond necklaces clutched their partners' arms, sensing that the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The whispered insults that had greeted my arrival died on their lips, replaced by a suffocating anticipation. They stepped back, forming a wide, clear path straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. They were expecting a humiliated victim running for the exit. What they saw was an apex predator marching toward her prey. My posture was completely rigid, my chin held high with absolute authority. I locked my eyes directly onto Valerie. The fake, triumphant smile on her face began to falter as I closed the distance between us. She had spent months planning this precise moment, scripting every cruel joke and fake expression of pity. But she had never anticipated that the ghost of DeAndre Past would march up the stairs to challenge her. Her carefully constructed facade of upper-class superiority began to crack, revealing the desperate, insecure fraud hiding beneath the couture. She looked over at DeAndre, expecting him to step down and stop me, but DeAndre was frozen in sheer terror. He backed away from the microphone stand, his eyes darting wildly between my approaching figure and the child guarded by a mountain of muscle at the back of the room. I reached the base of the stage. The Vanguard executives in the front row shifted uncomfortably in their expensive seats, recognizing the absolute lack of fear in my demeanor. I did not pause or hesitate for a single second. I climbed the 5 carpeted steps with the slow, deliberate grace of a queen ascending her rightful throne. Valerie took a sudden step back, her expensive stolen gown rustling loudly against the stage floor. The microphone in her hand trembled slightly. She opened her mouth to hurl another nasty insult, but the sheer gravity of my physical presence choked the words right out of her throat. I did not look like the sad, exhausted woman on the screens behind her. I looked like untouchable money. I looked like absolute power. I looked like the owner of the very building she was standing in. I walked right up to her, invading her personal space, until she was forced to lean back. She was breathing heavily, her eyes wide with sudden, inexplicable panic. I reached out and wrapped my steady fingers around the microphone. For a brief second, she tried to hold onto it, but I leveled a gaze at her so cold and unyielding that her fingers instantly went slack. I pulled the microphone easily from her trembling hand. I turned away from her and faced the massive ballroom. 300 of Atlanta's most influential people stared up at me in absolute, dead silence. You could hear a pin drop in the massive space. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. I let the heavy silence hang for a long, deliberate moment, allowing the tension to stretch and tighten until it was nearly unbearable for everyone watching. Then I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice was smooth, rich, and completely devoid of anger. "Since we are sharing truths tonight, let us look at the real bride." I opened my black evening clutch and pulled out a sleek black USB drive, holding it up high for the entire room to see. "Desmond." My corporate attorney stepped out from the heavy velvet curtains near the side of the stage. He moved with the quiet, predatory grace of a man who dismantled businesses for a living. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, his expression completely devoid of mercy. He walked up the wooden stairs to the elevated sound booth. The young man hired to manage the wedding music held up a hand to stop him. Desmond simply leaned in and whispered a single sentence. The young man immediately went pale, stepped back, and raised both hands in total surrender. Desmond took the black drive from my hand, plugged it directly into the master laptop, and bypassed the romantic wedding playlist. The massive digital screens flanking the grand stage went entirely black for 2 agonizing seconds. The entire ballroom held its breath. When the screens flared back to life, the soft romantic images of Valerie posing in imported couture vanished completely. They were replaced by stark, glaringly bright financial documents. The harsh white background and heavy black text of certified bank statements, credit reports, and legal notices illuminated the dark room. "Allow me to introduce the woman of the hour," I said into the microphone. My voice was a calm, steady wave washing over the stunned crowd. Valerie loves to tell everyone in Atlanta that she is a wealthy oil heiress from Texas. She claims her family funded this $500,000 wedding. She claims her designer lifestyle is the product of generations of generational wealth. Let us examine that wealth. I pointed to the left screen. What you are looking at is a certified financial audit. Valerie currently holds exactly $150,000 in maxed-out credit card debt. Those luxury cars she posts on her social media, they are leased. And as you can see from the third document on the screen, the dealership has already filed repossession orders because she is 4 months behind on payments. She was also formally evicted from her luxury apartment in Buckhead last Tuesday for failing to pay rent for half a year. The elite crowd erupted in hushed, vicious whispers. I saw wives of prominent executives leaning into their husbands, their eyes wide with scandalized delight. In this highly exclusive circle of affluent society, nothing was more unforgivable than a poorly executed fraud. I pointed to the right screen. Her parents do not own oil fields in Texas. They own a struggling dry cleaning business in the suburbs of Houston. There is absolutely no family trust fund. There is no endless supply of capital. Her entire influencer persona was built on a foundation of lies and stolen assets. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Valerie. She was frozen in place, her face drained of all the arrogant color she had worn just moments ago. Her mouth hung open, but she could not produce a single sound. 3 years ago, I continued, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Valerie stole my private client list from the marketing firm where we both worked. She used my personal connections, my hard work, and my industry reputation to secure fake brand deals. She leached off my success to buy her initial followers and construct a glamorous facade. She presented herself to this city as an elite businesswoman, when in reality, she is nothing more than a desperate broke con artist looking for a wealthy host to attach herself to. The humiliation in the room was palpable, suffocating. I watched the Vanguard equity executives sitting in the front row. These were men and women who managed billion-dollar portfolios. They evaluated risk and detected financial fraud for a living. And right now, they were looking at DeAndre with absolute sheer disgust. He was supposed to be their newly promoted investment director, a man trusted to make brilliant financial decisions for their firm. Instead, he had been spectacularly conned by a woman with a fake background and a mountain of consumer debt. He had brought a massive liability into their highly guarded inner circle. Down on the floor, I saw Corinne, his mother, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. She had spent the last year bragging to her country club friends about her son marrying into Texas oil money. She had worshipped Valerie, treating her like royalty, while she treated me like absolute dirt. Now Corinne was staring at the undeniable proof that she had been completely duped by a clever grifter. Dominique, his sister, looked physically sick, hiding her face behind her hands to avoid the burning stares of her socialite friends. They had enabled this disaster, and now they were drowning in it. DeAndre felt their intense judgment. I could see the exact moment his fragile ego fractured. His entire identity was built on appearing superior, intelligent, and untouchable. He desperately needed the validation of these older, wealthy executives. Now he was the biggest joke in Atlanta. He turned slowly to look at Valerie, the woman he had discarded me for, the vibrant, successful partner he claimed he deserved. She was trembling, shaking her head frantically, trying to formulate an excuse. She reached a manicured hand out to him, still holding a half-empty crystal glass of expensive champagne. "DeAndre, please, I can explain. She is lying." "These documents are fake," Valerie pleaded, her voice high-pitched and frantic with desperation. DeAndre did not listen to a single word. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. His humiliation had rapidly morphed into a violent need to regain control. He stepped forward and slapped the champagne glass right out of her hand. The crystal shattered loudly against the stage floor, sending sharp shards of glass and expensive liquor flying across Valerie's custom $50,000 gown. "You lied to me," DeAndre roared, his voice cracking with blind fury. "You told me your father was paying for this venue. You told me your family was establishing a massive trust fund for our future. You are completely broke." Valerie flinched, stepping back into the glowing digital screen. Her fraudulent bank statements projected directly onto her pristine white dress, branding her with her own lies. She began to cry thick, dark tears, ruining her perfectly contoured makeup. But nobody in the room felt any pity for her. The elite crowd simply stared in cold, silent judgment. DeAndre spun around to face me. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his custom tuxedo jacket. He needed to prove to his bosses sitting in the front row that he was still a powerful, dominant force. He needed to destroy me to save face in front of the firm. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his ruined lapels, and marched up to me, invading my personal space. "You think this is a game, Sienna?" DeAndre spat, his voice dropping to a low, threatening growl meant only for the microphone to pick up. "You think you can waltz into my wedding, violate my wife's privacy, and project illegal financial documents in front of my colleagues? You have completely lost your mind." I stood my ground, not flinching a single inch as his toxic anger rolled over me. My posture remained flawless, my expression entirely unbothered. "I am the newly appointed investment director at Vanguard Equity." DeAndre proclaimed, his voice booming over the speakers to ensure the front row heard his impressive title. "I have access to the most ruthless, heavily funded corporate legal team in the entire state. I am going to bury you, Sienna. I am going to sue you for defamation, corporate espionage, and illegal distribution of private financial records. I will drain every single penny you have left from that pathetic divorce settlement. You will never work in this city again. I will make sure you are utterly destroyed." He glared at me, panting slightly, expecting to see the terrified, broken woman he had left in the rain 3 years ago. He expected me to cower. He expected me to apologize or run away in tears. Instead, I looked at him. I looked at the man who had abandoned his pregnant wife. I looked at the man who had stolen my dignity. I looked at the man who was now desperately trying to hide behind a corporate shield to save his pathetic, fragile ego. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a cold, terrifying, absolutely lethal smile. "You are threatening to destroy me using Vanguard Equity legal team, DeAndre." DeAndre let out a sharp, arrogant laugh that echoed across the silent ballroom. It was the sound of a desperate man trying to regain control of a room that had already slipped through his fingers. He puffed out his chest and adjusted his ruined tuxedo jacket, trying to stand taller, trying to project the absolute authority he believed he possessed. "Yes, Sienna," DeAndre sneered, pointing a finger directly at my face. "Vanguard Equity. Let me spell it out for you, since you clearly do not understand how the real corporate world works. I am the newly appointed investment director. I manage billions of dollars in elite client portfolios. My firm retains the most ruthless legal minds in the country. You are a bitter ex-wife who crashed a private billionaire estate to throw a jealous tantrum. You are absolutely nothing." He turned to the front row where the senior Vanguard executives sat. He offered them an apologetic, highly practiced smile, trying to reassure his superiors that he was perfectly capable of managing this minor disturbance. He wanted to show them he was a true leader, a man who could handle a crisis without breaking a sweat. I sincerely apologize for this pathetic interruption, ladies and gentlemen, DeAndre announced to the wealthy crowd, projecting his voice with forced confidence. My former wife has clearly experienced a severe mental breakdown. It is a tragedy, really, but it will not ruin our elegant evening any further. DeAndre spun around and glared at the back of the room. He snapped his fingers aggressively in the air, gesturing toward the estate security personnel standing near the heavy oak doors. Security. DeAndre barked, his voice laced with venomous authority. Get in here right now. I want this woman and her child forcibly removed from the premises immediately. She is trespassing on a private venue. Escort her out and call the local police to press formal charges. The ballroom remained dead silent. Not a single person moved. DeAndre frowned, his face flushing with hot, angry color. He snapped his fingers again, louder this time. Did you hear me? I said remove her. I rented this entire estate for the night, and I demand that you throw this trespassing woman out into the street. The head of security, a towering man in a pristine black suit, began to walk down the center aisle. DeAndre smirked, shooting me a triumphant look, expecting me to be dragged away in absolute humiliation. But the security chief did not reach for my arm. He did not ask me to leave. Instead, he walked directly past DeAndre, completely ignoring his existence. The security chief stepped smoothly behind me, crossing his hands behind his back, assuming a highly protective stance. He was standing guard for me. DeAndre's mouth fell open. He stared at the massive security detail in sheer confusion. "What are you doing?" DeAndre yelled, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "I am the groom. I am the client who paid a fortune for this venue. Do your job and throw her out." The security chief looked at DeAndre with an expression of utter pity mixed with professional indifference. "I am doing my job, sir," the chief replied, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "My job is to protect the owner of this estate at all costs. And as I stated earlier, you are speaking to the owner." Before DeAndre could process the crushing weight of those words, Desmond stepped out from the shadows of the stage. My corporate attorney moved with lethal precision, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He walked directly to the microphone stand I had left in the center of the stage. He carried a pristine black leather folder in his left hand. The air in the ballroom grew instantly colder. The Vanguard executives in the front row suddenly sat up perfectly straight, recognizing the unmistakable aura of a high-powered corporate lawyer preparing to deliver a ruthless execution. Desmond tapped the microphone twice. The sharp sound snapped everyone's attention directly to him. "Good evening, everyone," Desmond said, his voice smooth, rich, and devastatingly calm. "Since DeAndre has decided to bring up the prestigious name of Vanguard Equity, I believe it is highly appropriate to provide this esteemed audience with a brief corporate update." Desmond looked up at the DJ booth and gave a curt nod. The massive digital screens that had just exposed Valerie financial ruin suddenly flickered. A new document appeared in glowing high definition. It was an official Securities and Exchange Commission filing. A Form 8K, legally binding and freshly stamped. The heavy black text was filled with dense financial jargon, but the massive bold headline at the top of the document was impossible to misinterpret. DeAndre squinted at the bright screen. I watched his eyes track the words. I watched the exact millisecond his brain registered the information. His shoulders slumped. The arrogant, rigid posture he had maintained for the last 10 minutes completely collapsed. "What you are looking at, ladies and gentlemen," Desmond announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality, "is the official signed and finalized acquisition filing. As of 4:00 yesterday afternoon, Vanguard Equity no longer exists as an independent financial entity. It has been successfully acquired in a hostile corporate takeover. The firm, its assets, its client portfolios, and its entire executive board are now wholly owned subsidiaries of Apex Holdings." A collective gasp ripped through the front row of the ballroom. The senior Vanguard executives, the men and women who had just promoted DeAndre, turned entirely pale. They began whispering frantically to each other, pulling out their phones to check their secure corporate emails. They were entirely blindsided. A hostile takeover of that magnitude required absolute secrecy, limitless capital, and a mastermind of terrifying strategic brilliance. DeAndre stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the stage to keep himself from falling. His eyes were wide, wild, and filled with total disbelief. Apex Holdings. DeAndre whispered, his voice trembling. That is impossible. Vanguard is a billion-dollar firm. Apex Holdings is a ghost entity. Nobody even knows who the founder is. It is just a wall of corporate shell companies. Desmond smiled a smile entirely devoid of warmth. He opened his leather folder and pulled out a single sheet of heavy cream-colored paper, holding it up to the light. That brings me to my second point, Desmond continued, his voice slicing through the frantic murmurs of the crowd. It is my distinct honor and profound privilege to formally introduce you to the ghost you are referring to, the absolute architect of the Vanguard acquisition, the majority shareholder and sole proprietary founder of Apex Holdings. Desmond turned his body slightly, directing his full attention down to where I stood on the polished marble floor. He bowed his head, showing a level of deep, profound respect that money alone could never buy. Allow me to introduce my client and your new absolute superior, Madam Chief Executive Officer Sienna. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that swallowed all the air in the room. 300 wealthy socialites, prominent business leaders, and ruthless investors stared at me in stunned, horrified awe. The woman standing before them was not a bitter ex-wife crashing a wedding. She was a financial titan, a billionaire predator who had just swallowed one of the most powerful equity firms in the state without anyone even noticing. Down on the marble floor, the senior Vanguard executives immediately scrambled to their feet. These were powerful older men who had ignored me all evening. Now they stood in a hurried, frantic line, straightening their jackets and bowing their heads in a spontaneous display of absolute submission to their new boss. They completely abandoned DeAndre, leaving him entirely isolated on the stage. Corinne and Dominique, who had been watching from the sidelines, physically recoiled. Corinne grabbed her chest, gasping for air, as she watched the most powerful men in Atlanta bow to the woman she used to mock. Dominique shrank back against the wall, terrified that I might turn my gaze on her next. DeAndre's face went entirely ashen. His skin turned a sickly grayish hue. The arrogant sneer, the condescending pity, the toxic superiority, it all evaporated, leaving nothing but a hollow, terrified shell of a man. He looked at the SEC filing on the screen, then down at me. His knees physically buckled, and he dropped down onto the carpeted stairs of the stage, unable to support his own weight. He remembered throwing my suitcases into the freezing rain. He remembered calling me useless, calling me a failure, claiming I contributed zero value to his life. He remembered fighting to leave me destitute in the divorce, while he bragged about his rising corporate trajectory. And now the useless woman he had discarded owned his entire universe. She owned the firm he worked for. She owned the executives he answered to. She owned the very ground he was currently sitting on. His entire identity, his wealth, his status, his career was held entirely in the palm of my hand. I could crush him with a single whisper, and he knew it. Valerie was sobbing uncontrollably in the background, her fake influencer empire and her gold-digging dreams completely annihilated. But DeAndre did not even look at her. He kept his wide, terrified eyes locked entirely on me. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to offer some pathetic, desperate apology, but his throat was completely dry. I did not gloat. I did not laugh. I simply took a slow, deliberate step closer to him. The click of my heel against the marble floor sounded like a judge gavel coming down to deliver a final sentence. I looked down at his shaking, trembling form with absolute cold detachment. I felt no anger. I felt no sadness. I felt the pure, liberating power of absolute execution. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my posture perfectly straight. My eyes bored directly into his soul, stripping away every last ounce of his pathetic dignity. I spoke in a quiet, lethal tone, making sure every single person in the massive ballroom heard my next words. That is just business, DeAndre. Now let us talk about the theft. 1,500 words. The word theft hung in the stagnant air of the ballroom. It was a heavy, dangerous word. In elite corporate circles, it was the ultimate death sentence. DeAndre flinched as if I had physically struck him. He looked wildly at the Vanguard executives in the front row, hoping to find some shred of sympathy or understanding. He found absolutely none. Their faces were carved from stone. They were no longer looking at a promising young director. They were looking at a catastrophic liability. I did not break eye contact with my ex-husband. I raised my hand slightly, signaling Desmond, who was still standing efficiently by the sound booth. Desmond tapped a single key on the laptop. The massive digital screens behind me shifted instantly. The Securities and Exchange Commission filing vanished. In its place appeared a highly detailed forensic accounting audit. The document was a blinding white with stark red highlights circling specific unauthorized transactions. It was the kind of undeniable financial footprint that sent men in custom suits to federal prison. The entire ballroom fell dead silent. You could hear the faint rustle of expensive silk dresses as the guests leaned forward trying to read the glowing numbers. I turned gracefully toward the screen, letting the undeniable proof wash over the crowd. "What you are looking at is a comprehensive internal audit of Vanguard Equity," I announced, my voice echoing cleanly through the massive space. This audit was initiated immediately after Apex Holdings finalized the hostile takeover. Whenever I acquire a new firm, I sweep the floors. I look for cracks in the foundation. I look for weaknesses. And unfortunately for your new investment director, I found a massive gaping hole in a highly secure Tier 1 investment portfolio. I paused, letting the executives in the front row digest the reality of their compromised system. DeAndre began to physically shake. Sweat beaded on his forehead, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. He knew exactly what portfolio I was talking about. He had thought he was so clever covering his tracks with layered transfers, but he was entirely out of his depth. According to the internal logs, I continued my tone conversational, yet completely lethal. DeAndre used his newly granted executive clearance to bypass 3 separate security protocols. He authorized a series of ghost transfers funneling corporate funds through 2 dummy accounts before the money finally landed in his personal checking account. The total amount missing from the secure portfolio is exactly $500,000. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the audience. $500,000. It was a staggering amount of money to steal in plain sight. Valerie let out a sharp gasp. She covered her mouth with her hands, her perfectly manicured nails trembling against her pale cheeks. The fraudulent heiress was finally realizing that her grand luxury wedding was entirely financed by stolen corporate funds. I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, looking directly down at DeAndre, who was still slumped on the carpeted steps. I wanted him to feel the full crushing weight of his arrogance. "You really thought you were untouchable, DeAndre," I said. "You thought the promotion made you a king. But kings do not have to steal from their employers to impress women who lie about their pedigree. I matched every single withdrawal from your personal account to the exact dates of the vendor deposits for this wedding." I gestured back to the screen. Desmond smoothly transitioned to the next slide. It displayed a side-by-side comparison. On the left were the illegal transfers from Vanguard. On the right were the corresponding payments for the event. $80,000 for the Rosewood Estate venue rental, I recited calmly, watching his colleagues shake their heads in absolute disgust. $50,000 for custom floral arrangements. Another $50,000 for the imported champagne you just shattered on the floor. And let us not forget the massive wire transfer made exactly 6 weeks ago to a luxury jeweler in Buckhead. $120,000 for Valerie Diamond engagement ring. Every single detail of their fairy tale romance was a documented crime. The beautiful wedding gown, the towering cake, the classical musicians playing in the corner. Every beautiful thing they had flaunted in front of Atlanta elite African-American society was paid for with stolen money. Valerie had invited the presidents of legacy organizations and members of exclusive social clubs just to show off wealth that did not even belong to her husband. Corinne let out a loud, dramatic wail from the sidelines. The toxic matriarch who had praised DeAndre's financial genius all evening was now watching her golden boy be exposed as a common thief. She clutched the fabric of her expensive dress, swaying on her feet. Dominique grabbed her mother's arm, looking around frantically for an exit. But my security guards were blocking the massive oak doors. There was no escape from this public execution. They had wanted an audience to witness my humiliation, and now that same audience was witnessing their absolute ruin. DeAndre scrambled to his feet. His chest heaved as he desperately searched for a way out of the trap. He looked at the Vanguard executives and threw his hands up in a placating, panicked gesture. He needed them to believe he was not a criminal. He needed to spin the narrative, just like he had spun the narrative of our divorce. He needed to prove he was still the smartest man in the room. "It is not what it looks like," DeAndre stammered. His voice was high and thin, completely stripped of its usual deep arrogance. "I was not stealing. I can explain everything. It was just a temporary bridge loan." "Yes, a bridge loan. I was going to put the money back next quarter. I have my annual bonuses coming up. The accounts were going to be fully reimbursed. I just needed liquid cash to cover the vendor deposits because Valerie family funds were tied up in Texas real estate." He pointed a shaking finger at Valerie, trying to throw his new bride directly under the bus to save his own skin. Valerie recoiled, her face twisting in betrayal and pure panic as she realized her new husband was willing to sacrifice her freedom for his own. "She told me the money was coming," DeAndre pleaded, looking at the silent executives. "She promised me her father was going to wire the venue fees. I only moved the capital to hold the reservation. It was a temporary corporate maneuver. Nobody was supposed to get hurt. I am a loyal employee. I would never intentionally defraud the firm." The sheer pathetic desperation of his excuse made the room physically recoil. The Vanguard executives simply stared at him with cold, unforgiving eyes. A temporary bridge loan from a secure client portfolio without authorization was not a corporate maneuver. It was grand larceny. It was a severe federal crime, and every single person in the financial sector knew it. I watched him flail. I watched the man who had called me useless and barren reduce himself to a begging, stammering mess in front of the entire city. He was willing to blame his new wife, to blame the vendors, to blame anyone but his own insatiable greed. He had spent 3 years building an illusion of superiority, and now he was drowning in the reality of his own pathetic choices. His immaculate reputation was disintegrating right before my eyes. "Sienna, please," DeAndre begged, turning his desperate gaze back to me. His eyes were wide and frantic. "You have to understand. You know how much pressure I was under to maintain appearances. You know how important this promotion was to me. I was going to replace the funds. You own the company now. You can authorize the withdrawal retroactively. You can fix this. Just sign the paperwork and make it a sanctioned loan. We were married for 10 years, Sienna. You cannot do this to me." I felt absolutely nothing for him. No pity, no residual affection. Just the clean, sharp precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. He was asking the woman he had discarded in the rain to retroactively pardon his felonies to protect the fake life he had built with his mistress. He wanted me to save him from the very trap he had eagerly walked into. The audacity was truly breathtaking. I gripped the microphone and took one final step toward the edge of the stage, standing directly above him. I looked down at his panicked, sweating face. The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the rapid, ragged sound of his breathing. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power does not shout. It whispers. I leaned into the microphone, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy whisper that carried through the massive speakers and settled deep into the bones of every single person in the room. "You did not just steal from Vanguard, DeAndre." DeAndre blinked, his face twisting in sudden, fresh confusion. He looked up at me, his chest rising and falling rapidly. I watched the exact moment the final realization began to dawn on him. I watched the last shred of hope evaporate from his eyes as the true magnitude of his fatal mistake finally clicked into place. I wanted him to carry this exact sentence with him into his federal holding cell. "That specific portfolio was my personal private capital. You stole $500,000 from me to fund a wedding designed to humiliate me." The absolute magnitude of that statement struck DeAndre with the force of a physical blow. His legs gave out completely. He collapsed onto the hard marble floor, landing squarely on his knees in his custom-tailored tuxedo. The sharp sound of his kneecaps hitting the stone echoed across the silent ballroom. He was no longer the arrogant executive looking down on a pathetic ex-wife. He was a cornered animal, realizing he had walked directly into a steel trap. He stared up at me, his chest heaving, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The wealthy guests surrounding the stage took another collective step backward, treating him like a highly contagious disease. The Vanguard executives in the front row began actively pulling out their phones, typing furious emails to their legal departments to completely sever any association with the man kneeling on the floor. "Sienna, please," DeAndre gasped, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. He crawled forward on his knees, ignoring the sharp shards of shattered crystal from the broken champagne glass cutting into his expensive trousers. "You cannot do this. We are family. We were married for 10 years. You know my heart. You know I am a good man. Please, Sienna, I am begging you. Keep this between us. We can handle this privately. Do not bring the federal authorities into our family business." He was weeping openly, now thick tears rolling down his cheeks and dripping onto his silk lapels. The sheer audacity of his words was astounding. He was invoking the sanctity of family only after his corporate shield had been completely obliterated. When he thought I was just a struggling single mother, he was perfectly happy to let Valerie publicly destroy my character on giant digital screens. But now that he was facing federal prison for grand larceny, he suddenly remembered our decade of marriage. He suddenly believed in the concept of handling things privately. I looked down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. I did not offer a single word of comfort. My silence forced him to scramble for another lifeline. His panicked eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for anything he could use to save himself. His gaze landed on the back of the ballroom, where my towering bodyguard Marcus stood forming an impenetrable wall of muscle in front of my 3-year-old daughter Naomi. A sudden desperate spark ignited in DeAndre's terrified eyes. He pointed a trembling finger toward the back of the room, his voice rising in a hysterical pitch. "Naomi?" he shouted, his voice echoing loudly. "That is my daughter. She is my flesh and blood. You cannot do this to the father of your child, Sienna. Look at her eyes. She has my grandfather eyes. She is a part of me. You cannot send your own daughter-father to a federal penitentiary. It would destroy her. Think about Naomi. Think about our little girl. You have to drop these charges for her sake." The hypocrisy of his plea was almost physically nauseating. For 3 entire years, he had actively pretended that child did not exist. He had thrown me out into the freezing rain while I was holding the positive pregnancy test, calling me barren and useless. He had never paid a single cent for her medical bills, her food, or her clothing. He had never sent a birthday card. He had completely erased her from his glossy new reality. Yet the very second he needed a human shield to block a federal indictment, he suddenly transformed into a devoted father, begging for the sake of his beloved daughter. His desperate shouting triggered an immediate chaotic reaction from the sidelines. Corinne, his mother, had been leaning against the wall, clutching her chest in horror as her son's financial crimes were broadcast to the entire city. But the moment DeAndre screamed about Naomi being his daughter, the toxic matriarch experienced a sudden, miraculous recovery. The gears in her highly manipulative brain began turning at a frantic speed. She looked at the digital screens displaying my status as the billionaire founder of Apex Holdings. Then she looked at the little girl standing quietly at the back of the room, wearing a custom designer coat. Corinne realized with sudden blinding clarity that the child she had mocked all evening as a pathetic adopted prop was actually the sole biological heir to a massive venture capital empire. The fake oil heiress, Valerie, was instantly forgotten. Valerie was nothing but a broke fraud, swimming in consumer debt. Naomi was undeniable generational wealth. Corinne pushed herself away from the wall, her face twisting into a mask of theatrical maternal devotion. She shoved past the stunned guests in her expensive gown, tears of fake joy streaming down her deeply powdered cheeks. "Oh, my beautiful grandbaby!" Corinne wailed loudly, making sure her voice carried across the entire venue. "My precious, perfect little girl." I knew it the moment I saw her. I felt the powerful connection of our bloodline. "We have to protect the family. Sienna, my sweet daughter-in-law, we must protect the family bloodline. Please let me hold my beautiful grandchild." Dominique, DeAndre's bitter sister, immediately caught on to her mother's strategy. She hiked up her obnoxious bridesmaid dress and ran after Corinne, echoing the exact same pathetic sentiment. "She is our family," Dominique cried out, her voice dripping with fake emotion. "We are her real family, Sienna. You cannot tear a family apart. We love her so much. Let us come together and heal. We can put all of this ugly business behind us for the sake of that precious little angel." They rushed down the center aisle, their arms outstretched, reaching greedily for my daughter. They looked like starving scavengers desperate to sink their claws into the ultimate prize. But they severely underestimated the perimeter I had established. Marcus, my lead security director, did not even blink. As Corinne lunged forward, trying to bypass him to grab Naomi, Marcus simply stepped directly into her path. He crossed his massive arms over his chest, planting his feet firmly on the marble floor. He did not touch her, but his physical presence was an absolute immovable boundary. Corinne collided with his solid frame and bounced back, stumbling over her own expensive heels. She gasped in shock, completely offended that a security guard would dare to block her access. "Move out of my way, you hired thug!" Corinne shrieked, dropping the loving grandmother routine for a split second. "That is my son-child. I have every legal right to hold my own granddaughter." I watched the pathetic display from the grand stage. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke clearly into the microphone, ensuring every single word sliced through their desperate noise. "Do not touch my daughter," I commanded, my voice echoing with terrifying authority. Corinne froze. She looked up at me, her hands trembling, her face pale with fear and unmasked greed. "Sienna, please," she begged, her voice dropping back into a pathetic whine. "You cannot keep her from us. We share the same blood. DeAndre is her father. The law will force you to let us see her. We have rights." DeAndre nodded frantically from his position on his knees. "Yes," he shouted, pointing at me. "I am her biological father. You cannot deny me my rights. I will fight you in family court. I will demand joint custody. You will not take my child away from me just because you are angry about a temporary financial misunderstanding." I looked down at the man kneeling in his ruined tuxedo. I reached into my black silk evening clutch. My fingers bypassed the gold-plated wedding invitation and closed around a piece of folded, heavy stock paper. I slowly pulled it out. It was not a pristine corporate document like the ones Desmond had displayed on the screens. It was an old, slightly crumpled paper holding a faint, faded brown coffee stain near the bottom corner. I held the document up under the bright stage lights. The ballroom grew impossibly quiet as everyone stared at the worn piece of paper in my hand. They could sense the absolute finality radiating from my posture. "You love to talk about the law, DeAndre," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. "You love to throw around legal threats when you think you hold all the power. So let us talk about your legal rights." I unfolded the paper with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I looked at the coffee stain, remembering exactly how it got there. 3 years ago, when I was 6 months pregnant and struggling to pay for basic prenatal vitamins, I had met DeAndre at a cheap diner to beg for a fraction of the financial support he owed me. He had been wearing a brand new custom suit, boasting about his upcoming vacation with Valerie. He had laughed in my face, spilled his coffee across the table, and threw a legal document at me, telling me he would rather rot than pay a single dime to support a child that would only drag down his elite lifestyle. He had demanded I sign it immediately, promising he would make my life a living nightmare in court if I tried to force him to pay child support. I had signed it with trembling hands, believing I was protecting my unborn baby from a monster. He had signed it with a triumphant, arrogant smirk, entirely thrilled to be legally absolved of all financial and moral responsibility. I looked down at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was bold, aggressive, and undeniable. I raised the microphone, bringing it close to my lips. "This is an absolute and irrevocable termination of parental rights," I read aloud, my voice carrying to every corner of the massive, silent venue. "It was drafted by your own attorney and signed by you 3 years ago. You initiated this petition, DeAndre. You eagerly, voluntarily, and aggressively surrendered all legal, biological, and moral rights to this child in perpetuity." I paused, letting the heavy weight of the legal reality crash down upon him and his greedy, scrambling family. "The specific clause you demanded reads as follows." I continued reading directly from the stained page. The biological father DeAndre shall bear zero financial responsibility, zero legal obligation, and zero custody rights regarding the minor child. This termination is absolute and cannot be reversed, contested, or appealed under any future circumstances, regardless of changes in financial status or personal preference. I lowered the document. DeAndre stared at the paper, his mouth hanging open in absolute mute horror. He remembered signing it. He remembered mocking me as he did it. He had created the very weapon that was now severing his final lifeline. He had built his own prison wall brick by brick to save a few $100s a month in child support, and now he was completely locked out of a billion-dollar empire. Corinne let out a devastated, harrowing scream. She clutched her head, rocking back and forth on her expensive heels, realizing her son had legally destroyed any chance she had of accessing my wealth. Dominique covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock, backing away from her mother as if the sheer stupidity of her brother's actions was contagious. DeAndre shook his head frantically, tears flying from his face. "No," he gasped, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. "No, you forced me to sign that. I was confused. I did not know what I was doing. I can appeal it. I will hire lawyers. I will tell the judge I made a mistake. She is my daughter Sienna. You cannot do this." I looked down at him, my expression completely devoid of mercy. I folded the document perfectly along its original creases and slid it back into my evening clutch. The satisfying click of the metal clasp echoed loudly in the quiet room. "You have no daughter here," I stated, leaving him to choke on his own bitter regret. The truth of his greed had finally sealed his ultimate, inescapable destruction before the entire world. The suffocating silence that followed my final declaration was suddenly shattered by a piercing, hysterical shriek. Valerie, who had been cowering near the digital screens, finally grasped the absolute catastrophic reality of her situation. She was 29 years old, drowning in $150,000 of hidden consumer debt, and she had just legally bound herself to a man who was moments away from a federal indictment. There would be no Vanguard equity salary to bail her out. There would be no connection to my venture capital empire through Naomi. DeAndre was not her ticket to the elite circles of Atlanta. He was an anchor tied around her neck, dragging her straight to the bottom of the ocean. The survival instinct of a desperate grifter kicked in with violent speed. Valerie wiped the ruined makeup from her face and lunged across the stage toward DeAndre. She did not look at him with the loving devotion she had faked all evening. She looked at him with pure, unadulterated venom. "You broke! Loser!" Valerie screamed, her voice cracking as she stood over him. "You told me you were a millionaire. You told me you had endless corporate expense accounts. You dragged me into a federal crime. I am a lifestyle influencer. My brand is everything. You have completely destroyed my reputation." She began hitting his shoulders with her manicured hands, desperately trying to reframe the narrative for the wealthy audience watching them. She needed everyone to believe she was merely a naive, innocent victim swept up in his devious corporate embezzlement. She pointed frantically at the Vanguard executives in the front row, her diamond earrings sparkling under the harsh stage lights. "I had absolutely no idea he was stealing from the firm." Valerie cried out, her voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "I am innocent. He manipulated me. He told me he was a senior partner. He told me his family had old money. I would never have married a common thief. You have to believe me. He is a monster who lied to his poor innocent wife." DeAndre scrambled backward on the carpeted stairs, trying to shield his face from her blows. The sheer absurdity of two fraudsters turning on each other was a spectacle that even I could not have fully orchestrated. DeAndre grabbed Valerie's wrists, pushing her away with a look of absolute disgust. "You innocent," DeAndre roared, his voice raw and ragged. "You drove me to this. You demanded the $50,000 dress. You demanded the Rosewood estate. You told me you would leave me for a professional athlete if I did not give you the wedding of the century. You knew exactly where that money was coming from." Before Valerie could launch another hysterical denial, a new voice cut through the chaos. Dominique, DeAndre's younger sister, marched forward from the sidelines. She was wearing her obnoxious bridesmaid dress, her face twisted with a mixture of terror and bitter self-preservation. Dominique realized that her entire family was about to go down in flames. Her brother was facing prison, her mother was sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, and her own social standing was evaporating by the second. She needed a scapegoat, and she immediately found one in her new sister-in-law. "Do not you dare play the victim!" Valerie Dominique shouted, pointing an accusing finger at the bride. "You knew exactly what my brother was doing." Valerie froze her eyes, darting toward her bridesmaid. "Shut your mouth, Dominique!" Valerie hissed, her tone instantly dropping its fake sweet pitch. "You do not know anything about my marriage." "I know everything," Dominique fired back, stepping onto the stage to confront her directly. "You bragged about it to me in the bridal suite 2 months ago. You told me DeAndre was moving secure corporate funds to pay for the florist. You literally laughed about how stupid his bosses were for not noticing the missing capital. You said you were going to milk his expense accounts dry and then divorce him the second a richer man looked your way. You manipulated my brother into committing a felony just to feed your pathetic shopping addiction." The entire ballroom gasped in unison. The wives of the executives covered their mouths, exchanging horrified glances. Dominique had just publicly confessed that Valerie was a knowing, active accomplice to grand larceny. She had completely stripped away Valerie's final line of defense, throwing her directly under the bus to distance the family bloodline from the crime. Valerie's face contorted into an expression of pure feral rage. Her carefully constructed facade of upper-class elegance shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She let out a guttural scream of pure fury and lunged directly at Dominique. "You lying, jealous, pathetic little snake," Valerie shrieked, grabbing a fistful of Dominique's meticulously styled hair. Dominique screamed in pain and immediately retaliated, swinging her arm and catching Valerie squarely in the jaw. The sharp crack of the physical blow echoed through the microphone that had been dropped on the stage floor. The two women violently crashed onto the polished wood, tumbling over each other in a chaotic blur of white silk and bright bridesmaid chiffon. The fight was brutal, undignified, and completely pathetic. Valerie dug her long acrylic nails into Dominique's shoulder, ripping the fabric of her dress. Dominique shrieked, kicking out her expensive heels and catching the layers of Valerie's $50,000 bridal gown. The delicate imported lace tore with a loud ripping sound, shredding the physical symbol of her fake wealth. They rolled across the stage, knocking over a massive crystal vase filled with imported white roses. The heavy vase shattered, sending water and crushed flower petals spilling across the electronic cables. I stood perfectly still, watching the implosion with absolute emotional detachment. I did not smile, I did not gloat, I did not lift a single finger to intervene. I simply watched the inevitable consequence of unchecked toxic greed. When you build a life entirely on deception, betrayal, and the destruction of others, you eventually run out of innocent victims to consume. When the external supply of validation dries up, toxic people always turn their ravenous appetite inward. They devour each other. I did not need to ruin my ex-husband or his new bride. I only needed to trap them in a room, expose the raw truth, and let their own vicious nature do the heavy lifting. I glanced over at the elite high society guests. The same affluent corporate leaders and wealthy socialites who had whispered cruel insults about me earlier in the evening were now actively documenting the brawl. Dozens of smartphones were raised in the air, recording every single undignified shriek, every torn piece of silk, every frantic, desperate accusation. They were capturing the absolute social ruin of DeAndre and his family in high definition. By tomorrow morning, this video would be circulating in every exclusive country club, corporate boardroom, and high-end salon in Atlanta. The family name was completely, permanently destroyed. They would never be invited to another gala. They would never secure another corporate partnership. They were officially the biggest laughingstock in the city. Corinne was still on the floor, sobbing hysterically, clutching her chest as she watched her daughter and her new daughter-in-law tear each other apart like wild animals. She reached a trembling hand toward the Vanguard executives, begging them to help stop the fight, but they simply stepped further back, wanting absolutely no physical proximity to the madness. DeAndre scrambled around the shattered glass, trying desperately to separate the two screaming women. He grabbed Valerie's waist, pulling her back, but she turned her rage on him, clawing at his ruined tuxedo jacket and screaming obscenities about his financial failures. Dominique kicked wildly, catching DeAndre in the shin, sending him stumbling backward into the massive digital screens that still displayed his federal crimes. "Stop it!" DeAndre roared, his voice cracking in absolute agony. He grabbed his hair, pulling at the roots, his entire world burning to ash around him. Shut up. Everybody just shut up. He wanted control. He wanted the silence he commanded when he was the arrogant golden boy of his family. He wanted to rewind the clock to a few hours ago, when he thought he had successfully buried my existence. But the universe does not reward the wicked with second chances. Suddenly, a loud, heavy thud echoed from the back of the venue. The massive oak doors of the grand ballroom burst violently open, slamming against the interior walls with a deafening crack. The shouting on the stage instantly ceased. Valerie and Dominique froze, their hands still tangled in each other's ruined hair. DeAndre slowly turned his head toward the entrance, his face entirely drained of blood. The elegant ambient lighting of the ballroom was suddenly violently pierced by harsh, erratic flashes. From the dark driveway outside, brilliant, chaotic beams of red and blue light flooded into the grand space, painting the terrified faces of the wedding party in the unmistakable colors of absolute legal authority. The sudden intrusion of the flashing lights cast long, ominous shadows across the polished marble floor. The rhythmic strobing effect washed over the high ceilings, illuminating the shattered crystal and the torn floral arrangements scattered across the stage. The elite guests standing near the entrance immediately parted, backing away in stunned silence as the reality of the situation fully materialized. The heavy, synchronized footsteps of law enforcement personnel echoed loudly against the stone entryway, signaling the definitive end of DeAndre's carefully constructed illusion. I stood my ground, holding my black silk clutch, feeling the cool, calm rhythm of my own steady heartbeat. I had calculated every single variable of this evening down to the exact second. I knew the authorities would not move quietly. I knew they would arrive with overwhelming force, matching the severity of the financial crimes Desmond had reported earlier in the day. The complete destruction of my ex-husband's life was no longer just a private family matter. It was now an official federal crisis unfolding live in front of the most powerful people in the state. He could not charm his way out of this. He could not manipulate a jury of his peers when his peers were the very corporate titans he had robbed blind. The sheer scale of his arrogance had finally caught up to him, leaving him entirely exposed and defenseless. DeAndre stared at the flashing lights, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow, panicked breaths, as the undeniable consequence of his betrayal finally walked through the front doors. The heavy tactical boots of the federal agents hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, rhythmic sound that shattered the final remaining illusion of the evening. There were at least a dozen of them stepping through the grand double doors of the ballroom. Local police officers in crisp, dark uniforms flanked the perimeter, immediately securing the exits, but the men leading the charge wore dark windbreakers with prominent yellow letters spelling out FBI across their backs. The stark, clinical reality of a federal raid clashing against the decadent backdrop of a $500,000 wedding created a surreal, terrifying atmosphere. The bright red and blue lights from the cruisers parked outside pulsed rapidly through the massive open doors. The aggressive strobing effect painted the vaulted ceilings and the horrified faces of the remaining guests in alternating washes of violent color. This was not a polite inquiry or a quiet corporate audit. This was a highly coordinated tactical execution designed to neutralize a major financial threat. The reaction of the elite crowd was immediate and absolutely ruthless. In the affluent circles of high society, loyalty is entirely conditional. It exists only as long as you provide value status or beneficial connections. The moment the federal agents crossed the threshold, DeAndre became completely radioactive. The wealthy executives, socialites, and corporate power players who had been happily drinking his imported champagne just an hour ago suddenly scattered like frightened insects. They moved with frantic urgency, desperate to put as much physical distance between themselves and the man on the stage as humanly possible. Nobody wanted to be caught in the background of a federal perp walk. Nobody wanted their expensive designer suits associated with wire fraud. The Vanguard equity executives, the very men DeAndre had desperately tried to impress all evening, were the first to completely abandon him. They turned their backs without a single word of comfort or support. They practically shoved each other out of the way to reach the coat check, demanding their luxury vehicles be brought around immediately. They treated DeAndre like he was already a convicted felon. He was instantly entirely erased from their exclusive world. DeAndre watched his prestigious network evaporate right before his eyes. His breathing grew terribly shallow and erratic. He remained on his knees, surrounded by the crushed white roses and the shattered pieces of crystal. His custom tuxedo was heavily wrinkled and stained with expensive alcohol. The confident commanding investment director was entirely gone, replaced by a hyperventilating coward who finally realized there was absolutely no escape from the trap he had built for himself. The lead federal investigator marched straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. He was a tall, imposing man with a stern, deeply lined face that showed zero tolerance for wealthy criminals trying to charm their way out of trouble. He did not slow his brisk pace as he approached the grand stage. He looked at the ruined wedding dress Valerie wore. He looked at the weeping mother hiding on the sidelines, and finally his cold, unforgiving gaze locked directly onto DeAndre. "DeAndre, you are under arrest," the lead investigator announced. His voice was a booming, heavy baritone that required no microphone to command the entire room. The words struck DeAndre like physical blows. He flinched violently, his hands flying up to clutch his head, as if trying to physically block the sound. He looked wildly around the empty space where his powerful colleagues had just been sitting. He looked at his mother, Corinne, who had completely stopped wailing and retreated into a dark corner, too terrified of the federal badges to step forward and protect her golden boy. He looked at his sister Dominique, who was actively hiding behind a tall floral arrangement, desperately trying to avoid eye contact with the advancing authorities. "You have the right to remain silent." The investigator continued, taking a heavy step onto the first carpeted stair of the stage. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." DeAndre began to shake uncontrollably. "No, wait, please," DeAndre begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "There is a huge misunderstanding here. I am an executive. I have money. I have connections. You need to speak to my firm. You need to speak to Vanguard Equity. They can explain the transfer. It was just a bridge loan. I am not a criminal. You cannot do this to me. You are being charged with 3 counts of corporate embezzlement, 2 counts of wire fraud, and grand larceny," the investigator stated cleanly, ignoring every single pathetic excuse spilling from DeAndre's mouth. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back right now." The reality of the severe charges hung heavily in the cold air. This was not a minor slap on the wrist. This was a guaranteed ticket to federal prison for a very long time. DeAndre completely lost whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left. He began to weep openly and loudly. He scrambled backward on the stage floor, trying to move away from the approaching agent. He turned his frantic, tear-stained face toward the few remaining guests who were trapped near the exits. "Please help me!" DeAndre screamed, his voice raw with pure, unadulterated terror. "Someone call my lawyers! Someone vouch for me! I am a good man. I am a leader in this community. I cannot go to jail." "Valerie, tell them. Tell them I did this for us. Tell them you needed the money for the wedding. Tell them it was your idea." He reached a desperate, trembling hand out toward his new bride, but Valerie recoiled violently as if his touch would physically burn her. She took several rapid steps backward, pressing her back against the glowing digital screens that still displayed her massive credit card debt. She looked at the federal agents with wide, terrified eyes, holding her hands up in absolute surrender. "Do not look at me!" Valerie shouted, her voice shrill and panicked. "I have absolutely nothing to do with him. He lied to me. He is a thief. I am filing for an annulment tomorrow morning. Keep away from me, you disgusting psychopath. I am completely innocent in all of this." She gathered the torn, heavy skirts of her stolen bridal gown and literally ran off the side of the stage, fleeing into the dark shadows of the catering hallway. She did not look back a single time. The woman he had destroyed our marriage for the vibrant, successful partner he claimed he deserved had abandoned him to the wolves the very second his bank accounts were frozen. DeAndre let out a gut-wrenching, miserable sob. He was entirely alone. His mother was hiding. His sister was fleeing. His bride had vanished, his colleagues had turned their backs. The federal agent reached the top of the stairs, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "Turn around right now," the agent commanded, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or delay. In a final act of sheer pathetic desperation, DeAndre turned his tear-soaked face toward me. He crawled on his knees across the wooden stage, stopping just inches from where I stood on the polished marble floor. He looked up at me with wild, pleading eyes. The arrogance that had defined his entire existence was completely burned away, leaving only raw, unadulterated fear. "Sienna, please!" he begged, his voice nothing more than a ragged, wet whisper. "Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. You are the only one who can stop this. You own the company. You have the power to drop the charges. Tell them it was a sanctioned withdrawal. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. I will do anything you want, Sienna. I will give you everything." I looked down at him, my expression perfectly smooth and entirely indifferent. I did not move a single muscle to help him. "I will leave Valerie tonight," DeAndre promised, speaking rapidly as the federal agent stepped up close behind him. "I will divorce her right now. She means absolutely nothing to me. I was foolish. I was arrogant. I made a terrible mistake, but I can fix it. I will come back to you. I will be a good husband. I promise you, Sienna. I will be the man you always wanted me to be." The sheer delusion required to make such an offer was breathtaking. He genuinely believed that his presence in my life was still a prize. He believed that offering to leave his fraudulent mistress would somehow convince a billionaire chief executive officer to pardon a federal crime. He still fundamentally misunderstood the powerful woman standing directly above him. And Naomi DeAndre cried out, pointing a trembling hand toward the back of the room, where my security detail kept my daughter safely shielded from the chaos. "I will be a real father to her. I will be there for every birthday, every single holiday. I will pay for everything she needs. I will be the best father in the entire world. Just please do not let them take me away from my little girl. Please, Sienna, do not let my daughter grow up with a father sitting in federal prison. Have mercy on our family." He reached out desperately, trying to grab the hem of my midnight black silk gown. Before his fingers could even graze the expensive fabric, the head of my security detail moved with blinding speed. He stepped forward and firmly kicked DeAndre's hand away, placing his massive, intimidating frame directly between me and the weeping criminal on the floor. The federal agent grabbed DeAndre by the shoulders, hauling him roughly to his feet. DeAndre struggled weakly, sobbing and pleading as the agent forcefully twisted his arms behind his back. "Look at me, Sienna!" DeAndre screamed, tears flying from his face as the cold metal pressed tightly against his bare wrists. "Tell them to stop. You cannot do this to me. I do not belong in a prison cell." "I am better than this." I stood perfectly still. I watched the frantic rise and fall of his chest. I watched the absolute terror consuming his dark eyes. I remembered standing in the freezing rain 3 years ago, clutching a positive pregnancy test while he locked the door in my face. I remembered the cold, arrogant way he had looked at me when he told me I was entirely useless. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, my heels clicking sharply against the marble. I looked directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. The ballroom was completely silent save for his ragged, pathetic sobbing. I leaned in close, ensuring my voice was low, steady, and perfectly clear. "You told me 3 years ago that failures do not belong in your presence." I said, my tone carrying the absolute chill of a harsh winter storm. "I am simply taking out the trash." The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists with a sharp, final snapping sound, locking his fate away forever. The heavy oak doors of the Rosewood estate swung shut behind the federal agents, cutting off DeAndre's final, desperate pleas. The sharp metallic click of the latch echoed through the silent ballroom, serving as the definitive end to his reign. The flashing red and blue lights from the courtyard slowly faded into the distance, taking the golden boy of Atlanta, elite corporate society, away in the back of a federal cruiser. He was gone. His career, his freedom, and his carefully constructed superiority were entirely erased in a matter of minutes. The sudden absence of his screaming left a suffocating vacuum in the room. That vacuum was instantly filled by a harrowing, agonizing wail from the sidelines. Corinne, the toxic matriarch who had spent the entire evening parading around in fake diamonds and unearned arrogance, completely shattered. The polished, elegant facade she had maintained for decades dissolved into a puddle of raw, unadulterated panic. She watched her son being hauled away in handcuffs, and the reality of their absolute ruin finally registered in her elitist brain. There would be no bailout. There would be no country club favors to call in. Her son was a federal criminal, and her family name was permanently destroyed. Corinne stumbled forward, her expensive designer heels buckled beneath her weight, and she collapsed hard onto the polished marble floor. She did not care about her ruined posture or the horrified stares of the remaining high society guests. She crawled across the shattered crystal and crushed white roses, dragging herself directly to where I stood. She lunged forward and grabbed handfuls of my midnight black silk gown. Her deeply powdered face was streaked with black mascara and tears. "Sienna, please." Corinne sobbed, her voice cracking into a miserable, desperate shriek. "You have to stop them. You own the firm. You have the money. You can hire the best defense attorneys in the country. You can fix this. He is my son. He is my only son. Have mercy on a grieving mother heart. You are a mother now. You know the pain of losing a child. Please, Sienna, do not let them take my boy away from me. I am begging you." She clung to the hem of my dress, weeping openly and pressing her tear-stained face against my shoes. She expected me to crumble. She expected the inherent empathy of motherhood to soften my resolve. She thought she could manipulate my humanity to clean up the catastrophic mess her family had created. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked down at the weeping, broken woman clutching my dress with an expression of pure, absolute detachment. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I simply observed the pathetic reality of a woman who had built her entire identity on tearing other people down. I slowly reached down and firmly pried her trembling fingers off my silk gown. I stepped out of her reach, forcing her to look up at my face. "You want to talk about the heart of a mother, Corinne?" I asked, my voice dropping to a calm, lethal register that cut through her hysterical sobbing. "You want to talk about mercy?" I stared directly into her panicked eyes. 3 years ago, I stood on your front porch in the freezing rain. I was shivering, holding a positive pregnancy test, completely terrified and alone. DeAndre had just thrown my suitcases into the street. I looked at you standing in the warm hallway holding your cup of tea. I begged you to help me. I begged you to talk some sense into your son. Corinne's face went entirely pale beneath her smeared makeup. She remembered. She remembered the exact moment she had chosen cruelty over basic human decency. "Do you remember what you said to me that night, Corinne?" I asked, my tone carrying the sharp, unforgiving weight of a judge rendering a final verdict. "You took a sip of your tea, you smiled at my tears, and you told me that a useless woman deserves to be left in the rain. You told me I was a barren anchor dragging down your son's brilliant potential. You watched him lock the door in my face and you did absolutely nothing." Corinne gasped, shaking her head frantically. "I was wrong," she whimpered, holding her hands up in a desperate plea. "I was so wrong, Sienna. I did not know you were carrying my grandchild. I would never have done that if I knew about the baby." "That is exactly the point," I stated coldly. "You only care about the child because you now know she is attached to a billion-dollar empire. You do not love Naomi. You love my money. You love the power I hold. You let me stand in the freezing rain because you thought I had zero value. Now you are drowning in a storm of your own making, and you expect me to provide an umbrella. You will find no mercy here, Corinne. You are getting exactly the weather you ordered." As Corinne collapsed back onto the marble, sobbing into her hands, the attention in the room shifted to the right side of the stage. Valerie and Dominique, who had momentarily stopped their vicious physical brawl during the federal raid, were now trying to quietly slip out the side exit. They thought they had escaped the primary blast radius. They thought DeAndre's arrest meant they were free to sneak away into the night and salvage whatever was left of their pathetic lives. They were entirely wrong. Desmond, my ruthless corporate attorney, stepped directly into their path, blocking the side exit with his imposing frame. He held a thick stack of manila envelopes in his hands. His expression was a perfect mask of legal execution. "Not so fast, ladies," Desmond said, his voice projecting clearly across the quiet ballroom. "The federal authorities have concluded their criminal business for the evening, but Apex Holdings is just beginning its civil proceedings." Valerie froze, her torn wedding dress hanging off her shoulder in ragged pieces. She looked at Desmond with wide, terrified eyes. "What are you talking about?" Valerie stammered, taking a step backward. "DeAndre is the one who stole the money. I had nothing to do with Vanguard Equity. I am completely innocent. You have no right to keep me here." Desmond smiled, a terrifying, highly practiced corporate smile. He handed the first heavy envelope directly to Valerie, pressing it firmly against her chest until she was forced to take it. "You are formally served," Valerie, Desmond announced loudly, ensuring the remaining society guests heard every single word. "This is a civil lawsuit filed by Apex Holdings. We are suing you for corporate espionage, theft of proprietary data, and massive financial defamation. You stole an elite client list from my client, former marketing firm. You used her proprietary assets to build a fraudulent social media empire and secure unauthorized brand deals." Valerie's hands began to shake violently. The heavy envelope slipped from her grasp, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. "We have subpoenaed every single one of your digital platforms," Desmond continued, relentlessly stepping closer to the disgraced bride. "We are seizing all revenue generated from your fraudulent accounts. We are suing you for $10 million in compensatory and punitive damages. By the time my legal team is finished with you, Valerie, you will not even be able to afford a minimum wage apartment. Your wages will be garnished for the rest of your natural life. Your fake influencer career is permanently terminated." Valerie let out a strangled, horrified gasp. The reality of absolute, inescapable financial ruin crushed her instantly. She slumped against the wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor, staring blankly at the legal documents scattered around her feet. She had tried to dig for gold and ended up burying herself alive in a mountain of corporate litigation. Dominique, seeing her former best friend completely annihilated, tried to turn and run the opposite way toward the catering doors. Desmond smoothly intercepted her, holding out the second envelope. "And for you, Dominique," Desmond said, shoving the envelope into her trembling hands. "A civil suit for willful complicity in corporate fraud and severe public defamation. You actively participated in hiding stolen federal funds. You assisted in the creation of a slanderous digital presentation intended to cause reputational harm to the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings." Dominique shook her head, bursting into ugly, frantic tears. "Please, no!" Dominique cried out, dropping the envelope as if it were on fire. "I do not have any money. I work a regular job. I cannot fight a corporate lawsuit. Please tell Sienna I am sorry. I will apologize. I will do whatever she wants. I will work for her for free. Just please call off the lawyers." "You will see us in court," Dominique, Desmond replied, adjusting his suit jacket with absolute finality. "I highly recommend you find a good bankruptcy attorney. You are going to need one by Monday morning." The systematic and total destruction of the entire family was now complete. DeAndre was in federal custody. Valerie was facing insurmountable civil ruin. Dominique was legally and financially obliterated. And Corinne, the proud, arrogant matriarch, was left weeping on the floor of a rented ballroom, completely stripped of her status, her money, and her golden child. Corinne realized she had absolutely nothing left. In a final burst of frantic, delusional desperation, she pushed herself up from the floor. She looked past me toward the back of the room where Marcus still stood guarding my daughter. Naomi was watching the commotion with wide, innocent hazel green eyes, safely shielded behind the massive security director. Corinne reached both her arms out, stretching her trembling hands toward the little girl. She ignored the legal documents, she ignored the federal raid, she ignored the absolute rejection I had just handed her. She clung to the only remaining connection to wealth and status she could comprehend. "She is my grandchild," Corinne wailed, her voice echoing with a raw, piercing desperation that cut through the entire venue. "She has our blood. She is the only family I have left. You cannot take her away from me. Let me see my grandchild." Corinne took a sudden, frantic step forward, trying to push past me to reach the back of the room. I moved with immediate, terrifying speed. I stepped squarely in front of her, blocking her path completely. The cold fury in my eyes physically stopped her in her tracks. I looked down at the pathetic, broken woman who had once tried to destroy my sanity. My voice was no longer a quiet whisper. It was a sharp, heavy blade of pure, solid ice cutting through her final pathetic delusion. She is an apex, I stated firmly, shutting the door on her existence forever. You are nothing. I turned my back on the stage, entirely dismissing the frantic, chaotic scene unfolding behind me. The flashing red and blue lights from the courtyard continued to sweep across the high, vaulted ceilings, but my focus narrowed to a single vital point in the massive room. I walked smoothly toward the back of the venue where my lead security director Marcus stood like an immovable mountain. Behind his massive protective frame stood my 3-year-old daughter Naomi. The ballroom was a symphony of destruction. Corinne was still weeping loudly in the corner, mourning the absolute loss of her generational wealth and social standing. Federal agents were barking sharp, clear orders as they secured the perimeter and processed the crime scene. The remaining high society guests were whispering frantically in panicked, hushed tones, terrified of being implicated in the massive corporate fraud scandal. But as I reached Marcus and stepped around his protective stance, all the toxic noise of the room faded into the background. Naomi looked up at me with her wide, beautiful hazel green eyes. She was clutching her small designer evening bag, looking slightly confused by the sudden influx of men in dark windbreakers and the aggressive flashing lights spilling through the windows. She was entirely innocent, completely untouched by the vicious greed and profound betrayal that defined the adults in the room. I felt a fierce, overwhelming surge of maternal protection rise in my chest. I refused to let the ugly reality of DeAndre crimes stain her perfect world for even a single second. I knelt down on the cold marble floor, bringing myself right to her eye level. The heavy silk of my midnight black gown pooled elegantly around my knees. I smiled at her, a warm, genuine smile full of absolute peace and unconditional love. It was the complete opposite of the cold, terrifying mask I had worn while dismantling her father life. You are doing such a wonderful job being patient, my sweet girl, I whispered softly, keeping my voice steady and completely soothing. The loud part of mommy work is all done now. We are going to go home. Naomi smiled back, her rare hazel green eyes shining perfectly under the grand chandeliers. She did not cry or fuss. She trusted me completely. I reached out and gently placed my hands over her small ears, blocking out the harsh sounds of federal agents reading Miranda rights and the pathetic sobbing of her toxic grandmother. I leaned my forehead against hers, creating a tiny, impenetrable bubble of absolute peace right in the very center of the chaotic ballroom. I shielded her completely from the toxicity of the very people who shared her DNA. They did not deserve to exist in her universe. They had forfeited the right to know her the moment they chose money and status over basic human decency. I stood up smoothly, lifting Naomi into my arms. She rested her head comfortably on my shoulder, burying her face in the soft silk of my dress, entirely shielded from the ugly spectacle happening around us. I wrapped one arm securely around her waist and used my free hand to hold my black evening clutch. I gave Marcus a curt, silent nod. It was time to leave. I turned to face the main exit of the Rosewood estate. Between me and the heavy oak doors stood 300 of Atlanta's most influential elite African-American socialites, corporate titans, and wealthy investors. 10 minutes ago, these were the people who had sneered at me. They had laughed when Valerie called me a pathetic charity case. They had eagerly watched the digital screens, expecting to witness the total humiliation of a broken, discarded ex-wife. Now they looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror mixed with profound, newfound respect. As I took my first step down the center aisle, the entire dynamic of the room shifted with violent speed. The wealthy guests scrambled to get out of my way. They stumbled over their expensive formal wear, frantically pulling their partners backward. The crowd literally parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, clear runway straight down the middle of the grand ballroom. Nobody dared to stand in my path. Nobody dared to make eye contact. They lowered their heads in a spontaneous collective display of absolute submission. I walked through the parted crowd with the slow, deliberate grace of a conquering queen. My designer heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, echoing clearly in the quiet space created by their fear. I did not look left or right. I kept my chin held high, projecting an aura of untouchable absolute authority. I could feel the heat of their stares burning into my back, but I was entirely unbothered by their judgment or their sudden, terrified reverence. They knew exactly who I was now. I was not just the woman who owned the million-dollar estate they were standing in. I was the billionaire mastermind who had swallowed Vanguard equity whole. I was the predator who had just orchestrated the most spectacular public execution in the history of the city corporate social scene. They knew I held the power to destroy any single one of them with a simple forensic audit and a call to my legal team. Their silence was the ultimate tribute to my dominance. I was halfway down the grand aisle when a pathetic, desperate voice broke the heavy silence. "Sienna, wait. Please wait." It was Dominique. DeAndre's sister had crawled out from behind the massive floral arrangement where she had been hiding from the federal agents. She scrambled across the marble floor, her obnoxious bridesmaid dress torn and ruined from her physical brawl with Valerie. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her makeup was completely destroyed by her frantic tears. She looked like a desperate, starving beggar pleading for a single scrap of mercy. Dominique pushed herself up onto her knees, reaching her hands out toward me as I walked. She did not care about her dignity or the hundreds of wealthy peers watching her humiliate herself. She only cared about the massive civil lawsuit Desmond had just handed her, a lawsuit that guaranteed her absolute financial obliteration. "Please, Sienna, I am begging you," Dominique cried out, her voice cracking into a miserable, high-pitched whine. "I am so sorry for everything I said. I will do anything you want. I will quit my job tomorrow. I will come work for Apex Holdings. I will be your personal assistant. I will fetch your coffee. I will clean your floors. I will do absolutely anything to pay off the civil damages. Just please do not destroy my life. You are family. Please look at me." She reached a trembling hand out, as if trying to grab the hem of my silk gown as I passed by. I did not break my stride. I did not slow my pace for a single second. I did not turn my head to look down at her kneeling on the floor. I treated Dominique like an invisible ghost. She simply did not exist in my reality anymore. Her desperate, pathetic apologies were entirely meaningless to a woman who had already moved mountains to build her own empire. Marcus stepped forward effortlessly, intercepting Dominique's outstretched hand and blocking her from getting anywhere near me or my daughter. He did not say a word to her. His massive, intimidating presence was more than enough to send her shrinking back down to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. I continued my walk down the grand aisle, leaving her to drown in the shallow, toxic puddle she had dug for herself. The heavy double oak doors of the grand ballroom loomed ahead. The estate valet staff stood frozen at attention, holding the doors wide open for my exit. I stepped across the threshold carrying my daughter, leaving the stifling, humid air of the ruined wedding venue behind me. The cool, crisp night air of the Atlanta evening hit my face, immediately clearing the lingering scent of crushed roses and spilled champagne. The sprawling courtyard was a chaotic scene of flashing red and blue lights. Several federal tactical vehicles and local police cruisers blocked the circular driveway, but my chauffeur had expertly maneuvered my sleek black Maybach perfectly into position right at the base of the stone steps. He stood by the open rear door waiting for my arrival, with professional, quiet loyalty. I walked down the stone steps, shielding Naomi's eyes from the aggressive glare of the police lights. I reached the Maybach and gently placed my sleeping daughter into her plush leather car seat, carefully securing the harness around her small frame. She had already drifted off to sleep, lulled by the steady rhythm of my heartbeat and completely unaware of the absolute destruction I had just unleashed upon the people who had abandoned her. As I stepped back out of the car to take my own seat, a loud, frantic shout echoed across the courtyard. "Sienna!" I turned my head slowly, looking across the paved driveway. About 50 yards away, a federal agent was forcefully pushing DeAndre into the back seat of a heavily armored police cruiser. DeAndre's hands were tightly cuffed behind his back. His custom tuxedo jacket was ripped at the shoulder, and his face was illuminated by the harsh, flashing red lights of the light bar. He was twisting his body, fighting against the agent grip, desperately trying to look at me one last time. Sienna, please! DeAndre screamed, his voice raw, desperate, and completely broken. The sound of his pathetic pleading cut through the noise of the idling engines and police radios. Do not leave me like this. Please. I am sorry. I stood by the open door of the Maybach, looking across the distance at the man who had once been my entire world. The man who had thrown me out into the rain. The man who had stolen my money to fund a fake life with a fraudulent mistress. He was finally experiencing the exact absolute terror and helplessness he had inflicted upon me 3 years ago. The scales of justice were completely perfectly balanced. I did not shout back. I did not offer a single word of comfort, anger, or closure. I simply looked at him with an expression of pure, total indifference. I turned my back on the police cruiser, ducked my head, and slid gracefully into the luxurious leather seat of the Maybach. My chauffeur closed the heavy car door with a solid, comforting thud, muting the chaotic sounds of the courtyard outside. I settled into the plush leather, taking a slow, deep breath of the quiet, luxurious air. Through the thick glass, I could still see DeAndre's face pressed against the wire mesh window of the police cruiser, his mouth open in a continuous, desperate scream. His voice was muffled, completely cut off by the superior engineering of my vehicle. I reached over to the polished wood control panel on my armrest. I pressed a single silver button. The heavy tinted bulletproof window of the Maybach began to glide upward with a smooth, quiet mechanical hum. I watched DeAndre panicked, tear-stained face slowly disappear behind the rising black glass. The thick tint completely swallowed his image, severing his voice and his presence from my life forever. The window sealed shut, locking him away in the dark and leaving me sitting in the absolute quiet peace of the empire I had built. The days following the raid at the Rosewood estate moved with the swift, brutal efficiency of a perfectly executed corporate takeover. I did not grant any interviews to the press. I did not release any petty statements on social media feeding the gossip columns. I let the absolute weight of the legal system and the ruthless nature of elite society do the talking for me. The fallout was spectacular, public, and entirely irreversible. DeAndre never saw the outside of a jail cell again. When Monday morning arrived, his high-priced defense attorney petitioned the federal judge for bail. The judge denied the request, instantly citing him as a severe flight risk and a danger to financial institutions. DeAndre was remanded to a federal holding facility to await his criminal trial. His prestigious career at Vanguard Equity was permanently vaporized, vanishing into thin air. The executive board fired him before the sun rose on Sunday morning, scrubbing his name from their website and issuing a press release distancing themselves from his crimes. His former colleagues refused to take his calls. The wealthy friends he had spent years trying to impress acted as if he had never existed. He was entirely locked out of the elite world he worshipped, reduced to an inmate number wearing a bright orange jumpsuit in a cold concrete cell. Valerie experienced an even more humiliating destruction. By Sunday afternoon, the cell phone footage recorded by the wedding guests had flooded every major social media platform. The video of her physically fighting Dominique on the grand stage, tearing at each other's dresses, went viral instantly. Financial bloggers and gossip sites got their hands on the bank statements Desmond had projected. The entire world saw the staggering mountain of consumer debt she had hidden behind her fake oil heiress persona. Her comment sections were absolutely decimated, filled with ruthless mockery from angry, betrayed followers. Every brand sponsor she had secured immediately dropped her, issuing statements condemning her fraudulent behavior. The civil lawsuit Desmond filed on behalf of Apex Holdings was the final nail in her coffin. We seized every single one of her digital assets, shutting down her fake life. Without her fake wealth to shield her, Valerie was forced to declare total bankruptcy. Her luxury cars were repossessed from the estate parking lot. She was evicted from her apartment. The woman who had proudly commanded me to find a seat at the back of the room was entirely stripped of her designer wardrobe. Within 3 weeks, the massive legal fees forced Valerie into the only job she could secure with a destroyed reputation. She was reduced to working a minimum wage retail job at a discount clothing store. Customers regularly recognized her from the viral wedding video, pointing and laughing as she folded cheap sweaters to pay off court fees. Her fake empire was completely pulverized. Corinne and Dominique suffered a different kind of punishment. They experienced the absolute devastating silence of social exile. In the affluent African American society of Atlanta, reputation is the ultimate currency. Once the details of their complicity became public knowledge, their entire social network severed ties. Corinne arrived at her prestigious country club for her regular Tuesday brunch only to be stopped at the front gates by security. The board of directors had formally expelled her, revoking her membership permanently. Her former wealthy friends blocked her number completely, refusing to be associated with the proud mother of a convicted corporate embezzler. She was entirely alone. Dominique faced the exact same isolation. The civil lawsuit Desmond served her guaranteed her financial ruin beyond repair. She lost her job at the boutique public relations firm when her boss realized she had actively helped cover up stolen corporate funds. Dominique and Corinne were forced to sell their expensive homes to cover their mounting legal debts, moving into a tiny, cramped apartment far outside the city limits. They lived in total isolation, turning bitterly on each other, trapped in a miserable reality of their own making. They had traded their dignity for a gold-digger illusions, and now they lived in total disgrace. While their world burned to the ground, my empire expanded with breathtaking speed. The hostile takeover of Vanguard Equity sent shockwaves through the national financial sector. For 3 years, I had operated Apex Holdings completely in the shadows, letting my representatives handle the public-facing negotiations. The wedding rage shattered that anonymity. The business world finally realized that a 33-year-old Black woman was the sole brilliant mastermind behind the most aggressive venture capital firm on the entire East Coast. Within 2 weeks, I was featured on the cover of leading financial magazines. Forbes and Black Enterprise ran massive exclusive profiles detailing my strategic brilliance and absolute financial dominance. I did not hide my past. I owned my story completely. The narrative of the broken, discarded ex-wife was permanently replaced by the reality of a billionaire corporate titan. I received thousands of messages from ambitious women across the country who had been deeply inspired by my silent, resilient climb to absolute power. My business expanded exponentially. We acquired 3 more struggling tech firms, integrating their assets into the growing Apex portfolio. I moved my corporate headquarters to the top 3 floors of the tallest glass skyscraper in the financial district. The offices were a monument to sleek, modern power, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the entire sprawling city. I walked through those halls with absolute confidence, knowing I had built every single inch of this stunning and incredible reality with my own hands. More importantly, my beautiful daughter, Naomi, was entirely safe and thriving. She attended an elite private preschool, surrounded by children of other successful business leaders. She took ballet lessons and played in the massive private gardens of my new estate. I ensured she never saw the news reports or heard the ugly details of her father's crimes. She was an apex. She would grow up knowing only unconditional love, profound security, and the absolute certainty of her own boundless worth. The toxicity of DeAndre and his family would never touch her spirit. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 month after the wedding raid. I was standing in my massive corner office looking out through the rain-slicked glass at the gray city below. The storm outside reminded me of the night DeAndre had thrown me out, but the memory no longer carried any pain. It was just a distant echo of a weaker, naive woman who simply no longer existed in this world. The heavy wooden doors of my office opened quietly. Desmond stepped into the room holding a single white envelope. His normally stoic face carried a trace of mild disgust. He walked across the plush carpet and stopped respectfully behind my desk. Sienna, Desmond said, his voice breaking the quiet hum of the office. We received a delivery from the federal holding facility. The warden office screened it and forwarded it directly to our legal department per standard protocol. I did not turn away from the window. What is it, Desmond? It is a letter, Desmond replied, stepping forward to place the envelope on my polished mahogany desk. From DeAndre. I slowly turned around. The envelope was cheap, thin paper. My name was scribbled across the front in frantic, shaky handwriting. It looked completely pathetic sitting on my immaculate desk. Desmond adjusted his suit jacket, his expression tightening. I reviewed the contents to ensure it did not violate the no-contact orders regarding the civil suits. It is a highly emotional plea, Sienna. He is begging for a response. He says the reality of federal prison has finally broken him. He wrote that he realizes the absolute magnitude of his mistakes. I stared down at the envelope. I felt absolutely nothing. No curiosity, no lingering anger, no desire to hear his pathetic apologies. He is asking for one final favor. Desmond continued, his voice dropping slightly. He knows he is going away for a very long time. He is begging for one final visit with Naomi. He wants to see his daughter just once before they transfer him to the maximum security facility. He says he wants to apologize to her. The pages are covered in tear stains, Sienna. He is completely desperate. I looked at Desmond, then back down at the letter resting on my desk. The man who had called me barren, the man who had stolen my money to humiliate me, the man who had gladly signed away his parental rights to avoid paying child support, was now weeping in a concrete cell, begging for a scrap of mercy from the woman he had tried to destroy. He wanted me to validate his newfound conscience. He wanted me to grant him absolution by offering him a final tearful goodbye with the very daughter he had originally abandoned. But I felt absolutely no obligation to give him peace. 1,000 words. I held the cheap white envelope in my hand, weighing the desperate pleas hidden inside. 3 years ago, a letter like this would have completely shattered my world. I would have torn it open, desperate for any sign of validation or remorse from the man who broke my heart. I would have agonized over every single word, searching for a reason to forgive him or a way to fix the broken pieces of our marriage. But looking at his frantic, scribbled handwriting now, I felt a profound, beautiful emptiness. I did not feel the fiery heat of anger or the cold sting of revenge. I felt absolute, liberating indifference. The power he once held over my emotions was entirely eradicated, erased by the undeniable reality of my own hard-won success. The grip he had on my soul had been completely severed. I walked slowly across the plush carpet of my corner office, moving toward the sleek industrial paper shredder, resting near my massive mahogany desk. Desmond stood perfectly still near the doorway, watching me with quiet, professional respect. He knew the history, and he knew exactly what this moment represented for my future. I did not open the envelope. I did not care about the excuses, the justifications, or the pathetic promises DeAndre had written in his cold concrete cell. He was a ghost from a past life, a life that no longer dictated my future or my worth. I held the envelope directly over the steel slot and let go. The machine whirred to life with a sharp mechanical grinding noise. I watched the cheap paper disappear into the metal teeth, instantly shredded into 100 meaningless, tiny white ribbons. The last physical tie to my toxic past was completely destroyed, falling like snow into the waste bin. The finality of the sound brought me an incredible sense of permanent closure. "Thank you, Desmond," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm. "You can return to your other files now. We are entirely finished with Vanguard Equity and its former employees. Tell the legal department to close the book on this chapter permanently." Desmond nodded, a rare, genuine smile touching his face before he exited the massive office. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut, leaving me in total peace. A few minutes later, the door flew open again, but this time there was no heavy corporate tension. A bright, joyful giggle echoed through the spacious room. Naomi ran across the carpet, her tiny designer shoes pattering happily against the floor. She was holding a large piece of colorful construction paper high above her head, completely beaming with pride. Her bright smile lit up the entire space, chasing away any lingering shadows. "Mommy, look what I made!" Naomi cheered, running straight into my waiting arms. I knelt down and scooped her up, lifting her effortlessly into the air. The heavy weight of the corporate world, the billion-dollar acquisitions, and the ruthless high society battles vanished the absolute moment I heard her laugh. I settled her onto my hip and looked at the painting she held in her small hands. It was a beautiful, chaotic mess of bright yellow and deep blue paint, a joyful, abstract creation of a 3-year-old who had never known a single day of fear or rejection. She was safe, completely protected from the vicious cruelty I had endured. "It is absolutely gorgeous, my sweet girl," I told her, kissing her soft cheek. "We are going to frame this and put it right on Mommy desk so everyone can see it. You are my favorite artist in the whole wide world." I carried Naomi over to the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that lined the entire edge of my office. We stood together looking out over the sprawling city of Atlanta. The storm clouds from earlier in the afternoon had finally broken apart, allowing brilliant rays of golden sunlight to pierce through the gray sky. The light reflected off the towering glass skyscrapers, highlighting the vast, wealthy empire we now commanded. Looking down at the busy streets far below, I realized the most profound truth of my entire journey. True power and ultimate karma are never actually about destroying the people who hurt you. Revenge is a cheap, temporary emotion that keeps you forever tied to your past. Real, undeniable power is about building a universe so incredibly high that your enemies no longer possess the oxygen to breathe in your presence. DeAndre, Valerie, Corinne, and Dominique were still down there somewhere, trapped in the miserable, shallow dirt they had dug for themselves through their own greed and deceit. But Naomi and I were standing at the absolute peak, touching the sky. They could look up at our success, but they could never pull us back down into their darkness. I held my daughter close, feeling the steady, strong rhythm of her heartbeat against my chest. She had her great-grandfather hazel green eyes, but she had my unbroken spirit. She would grow up in a world where her voice mattered, where her worth was an undeniable, absolute fact. I had personally taken the deepest, most agonizing betrayal of my entire life, and successfully used it as the solid, unbreakable foundation to build a massive, impenetrable fortress for us both. The tears I shed in the freezing rain 3 years ago had watered the seeds of an unstoppable legacy that would provide for generations. Have you ever had to stand completely still and watch while your enemies dug their own shallow graves? Did you find the courage to walk away and build your own empire? Please share your story in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to join a community of women who know that our silence is never weakness. It is simply the sound of us loading our weapons. Your worth is never defined by those who abandoned you. It is defined by what you build after they leave.